Einen guten Abend und herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, im Namen der Wiener Volkshochschulen. Ich begrüße Sie zu dieser Veranstaltung im Rahmen der Reihe Gegenbewegungen der Wirtschaft, ihren Platz, zuweisen. Und herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, im Namen der Wiener Volkshochschulen. Ich begrüße Sie zu dieser Veranstaltung im Rahmen der Reihe Gegenbewegungen. Entschuldigen Sie, das war ein technisches Malheur, ist aber jetzt gelöst, hoffentlich. Also ich darf Sie noch einmal ganz herzlich begrüßen. Die Reihe ist eine Kooperation zwischen der WU Wien, der TU Wien, der JKU Linz, dem Institut für angewandte Entwicklungspolitik, der Gesellschaft für Kulturpolitik, der VHS Linz und den Wiener Volkshochschulen, unterstützt von der Arbeiterkammer Wien und der Arbeiterkammer Oberösterreich. Die Veranstaltung wird auf Englisch abgehalten. Sie können Ihre Fragen aber natürlich gern auch auf Deutsch stellen. Sie werden dann übersetzt und eingebracht. A very warm welcome on behalf of the Wiener Volkshochschulen. You are attending the webinar Rehabilitating the Sharing Economy, which is part of the lecture series Counter Movements, Putting the Economy in its place, inspired by Karl Polanyi. My name is Stefan Jaksch, and I will be responsible for the technical hosting of this online event. We are on the webinar platform of Zoom, which means you will not be able to turn on your camera or your microphone during the event. Please contribute your comments and questions by using the F&A button. You can also ask your questions anonymously if you don't want your name to be mentioned. The chat will be disabled during the event. I wish you an exciting event and an evening full of new inputs and insights. And I will now hand over the floor to Justin Kadi, who will facilitate the event tonight. Justin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Stefan. Welcome everyone also from my side. My name is Justin Kadi. I'm a postdoc fellow at the TU Wien at the Department of Public Finance and Infrastructure Policy. The focus of this event is on the so-called sharing economy, a term that emerged in the context of the 2008 economic crisis. It builds on widespread dissatisfaction with business as usual capitalism and offered a kind of idealist discourse promising humanized exchange relations, environmental benefits, and autonomy for participants. But it has also been criticized quite heavily, and the companies have been criticized as being greedy, lawless, and exploitative, and causing urban pollution and dysfunction and other things. We'll hear more about this in a second by our speaker that I want to introduce now, Professor Juliet Schor. Juliet Schor is professor of sociology at Boston College. Her most recent book is After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. And she's currently researching the gig economy and the future of work, time use, and the drivers of carbon emissions. After the talk by Juliet, we'll have two commentaries by Elke Schüßler and Gruszka. And I want to also briefly introduce our two commenters. Elke Schüßler is professor of business administration and head of the Institute of Organization Science at Johannes Kepler University Linz. She researches societal challenges such as climate change and labor standards and studies how they can be addressed using theories of organizational and institutional change, creativity, and path dependence. And Gruszka is based at the Institute for Ecological Economics at WU Wien, and she's focusing on digital platforms, sharing economy, and the context of technology capitalism dynamics. In her dissertation and in her postdoc research that she currently is doing, she explores platform-mediated work and the growing precarization of labor. That's basically everything about our speakers for now. I'm very happy that you're all free here. And without further ado, I would hand over to you, Juliet, and then bring in Elke and Kaja afterwards. And I'm very happy that you're here, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Justin, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I can't help but say that when I got this invitation, I was expecting to be in person, and That was quite a while ago. So it is a disappointment that we are in a virtual format today, especially because I have had a very long and wonderful relationship with Vienna, and to a lesser extent Linz, but came first when I was a child, I think 8 years old, and have returned many times since then, and really loved the city and was looking forward to coming back. So I will return to Vienna and Linz, I hope, when traveling resumes. And for now, thank you all for being here. And let me now turn to my slides, which I'm going to use to talk to you about the platform economy, or the sharing economy, as we're calling it today. So as Justin mentioned, I have recently done a book on this topic called After the Gig. And so the topic that I want to address today is sort of, what can we do? How can we rehabilitate the sharing economy? But of course, in order to do that, let's figure out what it is, what needs to be rehabilitated, and why is there so much controversy about it? So let me begin with the claims that proponents of the sharing economy made when it was launched a decade ago. And I've called this the Idealist Discourse, and there are three main components to it: economic, social, and environmental. And you see here an ad from Airbnb, one of the largest sharing economy platforms, an early ad about, saying, look, Airbnb is wonderful for New York. So the first point is to make is that the Idealist Discourse, as I've called it, emerged out of Silicon Valley. So it's a technological discourse, and the arguments about the sharing economy and all the wonderful things that it will do are really track very closely arguments from Silicon Valley from 20, 30 years earlier, and what's been called cyber utopianism. So the idea that these new technologies are going to yield a host of benefits. Cyber utopianism was originally more economic, social, and political. The current version has an environmental dimension. Another, I think, important and interesting thing that's often forgotten in the conversation about the sharing economy is that at the beginning, it included both what we might call community sharing or nonprofit sharing initiatives, as well as for-profit platforms. In the United States, that has diverged, and the for-profits have kind of gone their own way. In Europe, I would say there is still more of a hybrid community in which the nonprofits are part of the conversation and part of an actual interactive community, as well as a discursive one, as well as having more for-profit platforms that are very community-like. For example, they don't charge, so they're donation platforms or barter platforms and so forth, that's sort of less monetized. What were the three main claims? The first was on the labor platforms, a new way to work without a boss and with freedom, the opportunity of giving income for a struggling middle class, and entrepreneurial opportunities. So a range of positive economic outcomes. The idea that through these platforms and apps, people could build social capital using peer-to-peer exchanges or person-to-person, and that they would reduce carbon and eco footprints. And I'm going to talk about all three of these and how things actually worked out. In the United States, the public mainly accepted these common good claims, or the Idealist Discourse. I did the first national random sampling polling of the sharing economy in 2014. We found that almost 2/3 thought sharing would lower ecological impact. 72% thought it would create social capital. 3/4 thought it was going to help them economically. So there was a lot of positive positive values or beliefs about the sharing economy. And in our early work, and I'll tell you what that work is just in a second, but my team and I found that people who were using these platforms largely as earners, or in the case of the community platforms where we were looking at a food swap and a makerspace, they also felt that the idealist discourse represented where they were. And so there were a number of feelings of certainly social connection and community, the ideas of getting away from impersonal exchange. They believed in personalized exchange, and also values around individuals' creativity, flexibility, and so forth. So what we called agency. But from the very beginning, the discourse was also contested. So this is the same ad campaign. The very day these ads went up in New York, they were defaced all around the city. So what this one says is the shared economy is a lie. And people were already worrying about the impacts of platforms on neighborhoods, so Airbnb, or the labor conditions under which drivers, ride-hail drivers, were working. And there was a lot of criticism of the idea that something like Uber is a sharing service, or even Airbnb is about sharing. That skepticism, which was present from the beginning, has really grown today. And so I think certainly in the scholarly community, and to some extent in the sort of broader community, the concept of that this is sharing is certainly greeted with some skepticism. So I've called this the sharing economy hijack. And the question that I will try and answer today is, how did we go from the idealist discourse and the win-win-win narrative of the early days to Uber drivers sleeping in their cars, intensified urban congestion and driving, and the shut up and drive option for passengers? That's something that Uber put in. And how might we rehabilitate this sector? So the work I'm going to talk about today comes from two projects. I'm going to focus more on this first project, which went from 2011 to 2018, it was funded by the MacArthur Foundation in the United States. And these are the team of sociology graduate students who I worked with for the most part. We had a few others, but these were the main participants in the project. And then beginning in 2019, I've started working on a more interdisciplinary team, again with sociologists, but also engineers and a lawyer, on a little more on the technological aspects of what we call the algorithmic workplace. And I'll show you what we're doing. So these are the cases. A lot of the work has been case study based, and then we did a lot of cross-case analysis. These were the nonprofits we studied, a time bank, a food swap, and a makerspace. The two bottom are pictures from the makerspace. And then we've done a lot of for-profit platforms. So Airbnb, TaskRabbit, which is an errands, Turo, which is Airbnb for cars, where people rent out their cars peer-to-peer. Postmates and Favor, which are food delivery. And now we've also added in my new project, Uber Eats and DoorDash. Uber and Lyft, of course, Prime Now, which is Amazon shoppers, and Instacart, which is shoppers and deliverers in multiple grocery stores, Deliv, which is a small package delivery company where we've done some really interesting work. We've had access to their data. And then at the bottom, you can see here care.com, which is a caring labor platform. And I added the logo for Facebook because we're also looking at people who are getting jobs on Facebook groups, private Facebook groups. And then finally, and I'll talk more about this one specifically today, what I think was the first academic study of a platform cooperative. So this is Stocksy United. It's a photographers cooperative owned and governed by the photographers themselves. We've studied lots of different topics, and we have many papers, maybe 25 or more by this point, but we have a lot of papers on Airbnb, on all of the service workers as well, the deliverers, the drivers, cross case. We're looking at regulation, we're looking at emissions. We're looking at food sharing as well as those other nonprofits and lots of things. I'm happy to come back to this slide. So just one point I've already noted, that the terminology, the sharing economy, is one which is very contested. I typically do not use it without air quotes to indicate that I recognize how complicated it is. And just to say, many different terms have come to be in use for this phenomenon: digital economy, platform economy, gig economy, on-demand, access economy, peer economy, etc. And again, happy to talk about terminology, and I've written a bit about that. But today, if I use the sharing economy, I just want to note that I would use it to refer to consumer goods and services rather than business to business, B2B, where there's also a lot going on with apps and platforms. Would include the recirculation of used goods. The only one that I've studied is the food donation platform Olio. Loans and rentals of durable assets, where we could talk about short-term rentals like Airbnb, neighborhood borrowing programs, car sharing, where it's like Turo, which is an Airbnb for cars, and then basically labor services, so ride hailing, delivery, errands, and then in the nonprofit space, something like a time bank, which is a labor service exchange. So key characteristics of these sharing platforms are, not all of them, because you have some of these that would go under this rubric that are not very digital, but the core of this new sector is algorithmic matching and management, so control of labor to some extent anyway through algorithms, the use of crowdsourced ratings and reputational information to deal with issues of quality and trust, low barriers to entry. So on most of these apps, anyone can join. Certainly, yes, on the consumer side, but also on the worker side. So some there are some disqualifying things. So, for example, certain kinds of criminal records will be disqualifying for earning on these apps, but something like Airbnb, I think, doesn't do a background check. This is relevant. So on the labor apps, for example, the earners control the schedules, they control the labor process to a large extent, they control their hours of work. That makes this kind of work different than many others. There's also a high degree of mutualism and reciprocity. And here I'd like to call out Professor Schüßler, with whom I have been co-editing a special issue of the Socioeconomic Review. And we, in our introduction, to that special issue, we pay special attention to those issues of mutualism and reciprocity. But I want to add one other dimension of these apps, which is really important and I think is sort of key to what's going on. And that's what I call stranger exchange. So for the most part, these apps began as peer-to-peer exchanges among unknowns. And that's where the ratings and reputational information becomes important, where the algorithmic matching and so on and so forth, because some of these kinds of exchanges have long taken place between people who know each other. So family and friendship networks. And what's, I think, unique about this sector is this person-to-person exchange among strangers. So what about the idealist discourse? What can we say about it? Did the sharing economy live up to its promises? Obviously, the title of my talk suggests the answer to that is no, otherwise we wouldn't need a rehabilitation. But in what ways? In what ways has it not necessarily done so? So let's start with environmental impacts. The platforms created a hegemonic discourse of eco-benefits. And here we have Thomas Friedman, one of the most widely read at the time columnists in the United States, writing in the New York Times, where he says, just think how much better this all is for the environment, for people to be renting their spare bedrooms rather than building another Holiday Inn and another and another. So it was a kind of common sense idea emphasizing the disruption, which is a terminology that the companies like to use a lot, the disruption to ordinary activities, whether if we're talking about ride hailing, which used to be called ride sharing, oh, I no longer need a car. I don't have to own a car anymore because I can get this very convenient, available, and low cost ride whenever I need one. Disruption to business investment. Companies don't need to build hotels anymore. We have all this spare capacity in people's homes. To goods purchasing, well, we can just borrow each other's things. We don't need to buy anything new. So a big disruption to the ordinary consumption activities. And that was the idea behind this, the eco benefits and the carbon benefits, especially, that were supposed to accrue as a result of the sharing economy. Well, Zipcar is a very interesting case. It's one of the earliest quote unquote sharing platforms. In many ways, it's not a true sharing platform because it's not peer-to-peer. The company ended up buying the cars, although the founder had intended to have it be more like an Airbnb for cars. People would have cars that they parked in their driveways, and other people would get access to them, and that would lead people to not need to purchase cars anymore. Of course, the manufacture of new cars is a big part of the total life cycle environmental impact of automobiles. And the founder of this company is a friend of mine and a very committed environmentalist. So it's an interesting case for what happened. So what did Zipcar do? Well, it started like this Zipcars live in Park Slope suggestion in dense urban neighborhoods where somebody would have a small car in a driveway and their neighbors would have access to it. But then it began expanding into universities. So that meant that university students could have access to cars. Typically they didn't. And in the United States, at least, it's hard for people of university age to rent cars. Typically the auto companies rent to 25 and above, or it's extremely expensive if you're below 25. These cars could be rented by the hour, so they were much cheaper than an ordinary rental cars. The cars were put in more places, and they also then started offering fancier, more expensive, higher impact cars. And a few, not too many years after this company began, it became very clear that they were actually increasing the carbon footprint associated. Their activities were increasing carbon footprints because they were making more cars available at cheaper prices to more people. And I have a friend who actually did a intensive consultancy for Zipcar and forced them to stop advertising their kind of green cred, which was something they were doing a lot in the early days, because in fact, his analysis of the data they gave him showed they were not reducing carbon impacts at all, quite the reverse. So this is actually a story that is repeated throughout the sharing economy, at least for the for-profit companies. And there are a couple of reasons why. The biggest one is lower prices, because the sharing economy reduced prices for access to transportation and accommodation. Those are the two biggest sectors. They're the biggest platforms, Uber, Lyft, Airbnb. They dominate the sector in terms of volume of activity. And what those platforms did was they made these goods and services available much more cheaply to people and increase the demand. So Airbnb, which spent a lot of time trying to prove itself to be a sustainable company and that it reduced impact and so forth, that story that Tom Friedman was putting out. When we look at what's happening with Airbnb, it turns out their story falls apart. So, and here we have them, and this is the biggest issue with Airbnb, what's called induced travel. But Airbnb dramatically reduces the cost of travel by making lower cost accommodations available on the one hand. And we also found in our interview data that Airbnb hosts would rent out their place and then travel as a result, because it would be so much cheaper to travel because they would have that income, which they could then use for another place. And some of them who had higher cost places that they rented out and would go stay in cheaper places, then also had that extra money, and there's the so-called rebound effects associated with that money. So the company in its propaganda says, oh, there's no induced travel, but there's more and more sort of survey and other kind of evidence of induced travel. It's been very, very hard to study this. There's evidence around rebound effects of the added incomes that are going to hosts. And my new project looks at sprawl within cities as the Airbnb listings began growing and moving out from center cities. We then have the carbon impacts of people moving around those cities. And in some cases, of course, they're using public transportation, but in a lot of cases, they are driving around. So there's that. I think that there's almost, there's really no evidence to say that Airbnb reduces carbon impacts. And I think let me add one more, and that's about the ride hail. And actually, I don't have a slide on this, but ride hail is the area where we have the most data on the impacts on carbon footprints. And in contrast to the early story of car sharing and people giving up cars and big reductions in carbon footprints as a result, what we find with Airbnb, with ride hail, with really sophisticated studies using the natural experiment of the fact that ride hail rolled out at different times across the United States, for example, that when ride hail services come to a city, registrations of vehicles go up because people aren't just using the cars that they have, in that idea of idle capacity, which was such a big theme in the early days of the sector. Drivers are getting new cars to drive. Congestion goes up, vehicle miles goes up, traffic fatalities go up, and of course, carbon footprints increase too. And the companies have finally come around to admitting this, and they've done some of their own research, which even shows the rise in congestion and by implication emissions. And the other really, ultimately what will be the bigger impact of this most likely is the fact that the companies are trying to get people off public transportation. And we have a crisis of public transportation, and we've had big declines in ridership over the period of time when ride hail began growing. And it's not surprising. It's a much more convenient way to go in the United States, where public transportation systems are nowhere near as convenient as Europe. And they were pricing specifically to compete against public transportation, where you could get an Uber ride at one point for $3 or $4. The area of the sharing economy that probably had the most possibility for reducing impact was the durable goods borrowing and renting and gifting platforms. The meme of the sector was, I don't need a drill, I need a hole in the wall, let me just borrow my neighbor's drill. And these are all platforms that started with that idea, either renting, borrowing, selling, reselling, etc. The only one that's been successful, and it's been successful in Europe, not the United States, is Peerby, started in the Netherlands, a famously frugal country where a platform like that, has more take up than the United States. In that polling that I showed at the beginning of my talk that I did in 2014, only 1 in 3 Americans said they would like to share more. So it's not a surprise that all of these have failed in the US, and therefore their environmental impact has not been positive. So they had a minimal value proposition and a very high failure rate. All right, let's move on. Social impacts. The social impacts are a bit diverse. In the early days, there was a fair amount of research saying that people engaged when they went on Airbnb. The hosts and the guests met each other. They developed relationships. We found that in our research for Schor. And people talked a lot about the social benefits. In ride hail, in the early days, Lyft drivers would greet passengers with a fist bump, and the passengers would sit in the front, and the idea is that you would talk. And that's all changed as the services have grown and normalized, they've kind of conventionalized, and the social dimensions have really declined. So for example, Airbnb, the work that we're doing shows the growth of the highly commercialized units really dominating, as opposed to the individuals who are renting in their own homes, or maybe one unit where they will interact with the people. These are much bigger commercial operations with no social interaction. Uber and Lyft. Uber put in this shut up and drive option where if you didn't want to talk to your Uber driver, you just press a button on the app so you don't have to show, I mean, that shows just how much things changed in the ride-hail space, where it really became just, like a service without a social dimension. There are a few, and certainly the community-based sharing initiatives have more social impacts. I would say the one of the bigger sharing platforms which still has a dimension of social interaction is BlaBlaCar, which is in Europe, a long distance car sharing, ride sharing for long distance rides where the monetary dimension is pretty minimal. Couchsurfing, which is it's Airbnb that's free, also has some has social interaction as well. And of course, the time banks and those community-oriented sharing initiatives have social impacts. Although what we found in our research on our time bank was much less than people actually went into it expecting or desiring. And it really wasn't that easy for people to make durable connections and so forth. Relatively few of those actually developed as a result of in the time bank we studied. And those have, the other part about the community initiatives is that they've been much less successful overall. So not a big impact on social. And what about the economic? This is what we've heard the most about. There's by far the most scholarly attention to this, the most public media attention and so forth. The economic dimensions have been dominated by labor issues. A lot of it in recent years has been around the question of the classification of gig earners as workers versus independent contractors. But let me just talk to you about the main finding, a main finding of my research, and which I think is really key to understanding both what's going on in the sharing economy now and also the kinds of structures that might rehabilitate it. So the first point I want to make is that to understand the experiences of workers in the sharing economy, scholars have mostly sort of focused on three approaches. The first is what we could call entrepreneurialism. It's coming mostly from economists and management. It's a very positive approach in which it says the sharing economy is great because it allows workers to be their own bosses. It gives them that freedom and to do so in an efficient way because of this technology that I identified earlier. And so, look, isn't this wonderful? And this approach sort of assumes that if workers didn't like it and it weren't positive for them, they would not be doing it. The second approach is is oriented to algorithmic control, and it's really about how the algorithms surveil, discipline, motivate, experiment on, but control workers. And so it's a kind of dark, totalistic view in its most extreme, which says there's this whole new realm of technological control, and there's a lot of control over the workers. And the third approach, which is probably the most common in the literature, emphasizes the precarity that these workers have because they're independent contractors, because the companies have shifted a lot of risks onto the workers. And this is what's notable about this approach in comparison to the first two, is that the technology really isn't doing much in this story, because the growth of precarity, or as Justin mentioned in the introduction, the process of precarization, that's sort of making workers more precarious, is something that's long predates the sharing economy and is occurring outside of the sharing economy as well. And of course, there are some scholars who combine some of these. But I think what's key about most of this literature is that either explicitly or implicitly, it tends to talk about gig workers as a homogeneous group. So they're either all controlled, or they're either all precarious, or they're either all have the opportunity to be entrepreneurs and so forth. Our findings come from a very different place, and we focus on the issue of heterogeneity among gig workers. Of course, much survey data shows that gig workers are heterogeneous, and it's not that these other scholars don't realize it, but many of the approaches don't really take that heterogeneity into account, and they tend to focus on the workers who are more dependent on the platforms and therefore more subjected to algorithmic control and more precarious, and for whom the conditions of precarity are more problematic. So what we find is you've got this broad difference in the workers in terms of their situations on the platforms, the situations they come to the platforms with. And we find that there are poor outcomes for workers who are highly dependent on the platforms to pay their basic expenses, especially those who are on the low-wage platforms, but that things are very different for the casual, or what we've called supplemental workers. And I think I don't have another slide on this. So basically what we find, and this is similar in our work, our qualitative research, and this is similar to what a lot of the survey data has found, a minority of the workers are dependent workers, meaning they're trying to use these platforms to carve out a full-time living. It's less so on the ride hail. Ride hail has moved to have more full-time workers. But so for those workers, they are very precarious. They are more willing to follow the algorithms. They are more concerned about deactivation, which is basically being fired by a platform. But the majority are casual workers who have other sources of income, who don't necessarily allow themselves to be controlled by the algorithms, for whom the money actually reduces their overall precarity. And their experience is very different. And so things like employee status look very different from the point of view of being somebody who works 5 hours a week on these kinds of platform and somebody who works 45 hours a week on them. And one other really important thing here is that over time, particularly on the lower wage platforms, we have seen an expansion of the dependent workers, particularly as the ride hail and food delivery, the wages have gone down. So the people with more alternative options are less likely to be working there. In the early days, the wages were really good and much higher than what was available in the lower wage parts of the economy. So that trajectory is important, and also that hierarchy of platforms is important. And the last point I want to make here is that what the outcome, the sort of implication of our findings is that platforms are free riding on conventional employers, because the workers who are having good experiences on these platforms are the ones who have other employers and other sources of income. The dependent work, what we call the dependent workers, the situation is not viable. They're earning at poverty levels. They're earning below the minimum wage. So the platforms are not providing a reasonable job experience for people who are dependent workers. And this is also true on a number of the high wage platforms, because there you have the trade-off between wages and demand. So one platform we did a lot of work on had very high hourly wages, but these people were all earning, $20,000 a year or less in US dollars. And, by the time the first decade of the gig economy ends, you've got many stories like this where Uber drivers are making so little, they're sleeping in their cars, they're, enduring really exploitative and awful conditions. They're greatly in debt, their health is endangered, and they're having all these negative externalities. for others. So I think one of the key things here, and this is the, finally, in some ways, maybe the punchline of my talk, the sharing economy is deeply connected to the conventional economy, both this free riding that I talk about, also the ways in which labor conditions in the conventional economy affect the supply of labor, the willingness of workers to work, the wages, and so forth in the sharing economy. Okay, so what about rehabilitation? Is regulation the road to rehabilitation? In the United States, beginning in 2018, you start to see regulatory momentum as the negative impacts of the sharing economy become more and more prevalent, and the early political successes that the platforms have in sort of staving off regulations start to crumble. So you get Airbnb regulations all across the country. In New York City, the Taxi and Limousine Commission puts in a minimum wage for workers, taxi driver, or ride-hail drivers of $27 an hour gross, $17 an hour after expenses. In California, they pass Assembly Bill 5, which makes all of these gig workers employees with a wave of the wand. However, regulation is not uniformly effective. We're finding, as we study the Airbnb regulations, that they're not necessarily reducing the supply of Airbnbs, and that the commercialization of the markets and more commercial operators versus just individuals renting out their rooms in their own home, that commercialization keeps going even when you have strict regulations that have been put in. The gig economy companies spend $200 million and are able to overturn, carve their workers out of Assembly Bill 5. And this is a big debate. We're happy to talk about it, but the DeLive case that we've been studying shows that that company switched its employees to switch its workers to employees in California in anticipation of AB 5, and they were able to maintain flexibility. Their costs did rise. But regulation has been, I would say, a really mixed bag. In the United States, the platforms are politically powerful. And we'll see how it goes in Europe. Of course, Uber has been forced to call its workers employees in the UK context. And there is, across the continent, much more contestation of labor conditions and so forth. But there's another option for rehabilitating the sharing economy that's getting more and more attention these days, and that is a more transformative option, the platform cooperative, in which the workers own the platforms. Platform cooperatives address the economic exploitation of many of the gig labor platforms. They allow the workers to reap the benefits of algorithmic management, which can really lower costs and eliminate a lot of layers of management. They have low barriers to entry, and they can offer earner freedom. And so the co-op that we studied was called Stocksy United. As I said, it sells stock photography, so photographers take pictures, they upload them to an image database, and the platform sells them to customers. There were about 1,000 artists at the time we studied it, with a very small staff, under 10 people. So again, one of the things that real benefit of those low management costs. This co-op was very financially successful. It did really well. It gave a lot more to artists. So artists got more than 50% of the sale price versus about 20% on standard sites. The artists were very happy. They appreciate the flexibility, and the governance worked pretty well. This is just a photo, that you can find on the site. But there were a number of challenges that are really important from the point of view of how platforms typically work. And this takes us back to our big finding of heterogeneity, which is that it's not just on Uber and Lyft that you have heterogeneity. This platform also has it, in which there's a great diversity in the way people want to participate. Some of them were hobbyists. They as they were referred to disparagingly by some of the more professionals, momtographers, like a mother with a camera phone who comes downstairs in the morning and takes pictures of her cute kids at breakfast and uploads them, to people who are investing large sums of money in shoots and are really trying to have a commercial orientation and make a living on this platform. And so the same kinds of differences that we saw on other platforms are here in a platform cooperative, which creates certain kinds of tensions and differences, these sort of supplementary versus dependent earners. And that's even on a platform that has a limited membership. The second is that this platform was a winner-take-all market. It's not something you'll see on a driver co-op or a food delivery co-op, but wherever you have where it's not just a pure labor service. Here you have the production of you could think of it as equivalent to a capital good. But we found that the top 20% of earners on this platform got 83% of the revenue. Nine contributors got over a quarter of the revenue. And that's so different than a typical co-op. So when you're talking about a platform co-op, it's not immediately an egalitarian solution. As I say, if you have a cleaning co-op, if you have a driver co-op, it's going to be a more equal distribution, but it also might have this kind of inequality in the distribution, particularly the more the workers are allowed to vary their hours and choose their schedules. And that's, of course, one of the most appealing things to earners in the sector as a whole, that freedom to choose schedules and not have to work according to the schedule of a boss. So to some extent, the revenue distribution is explained by effort, financial investment, and talent. But there's also probably luck and other things. And there are other challenges for co-ops who are starting up. The co-op we studied was very lucky. It had a lot of money to begin with, and it had very experienced founders who had already built a business in this industry and sold out to the Uber of stock photography. And they took that money and started the co-op. So the most possibly best, the best possible conditions under which to start. But most co-ops don't start that way. They have trouble raising capital and they have trouble attracting customers, especially in markets with dominant players, which are, the big markets here, ride hail and food delivery. Historical experience, I would say, also suggests that co-ops thrive under conditions of high levels of prior solidarity among workers, which is why you see them in certain areas of Europe, for example, where you had strong leftist parties that built strong unions or you had strong religious affiliations or strong ethnic affiliations. We can think of Mondragon, we can think of some of the Italian co-ops. And in the United States, the farmer co-ops fit that, which have been very successful. So it may be hard to get these going in situations where you have much more atomized earners or potential members. But there is one nice thing about platform co-ops in the current environment that's a little bit different than historically, which is that in cases of like food delivery and drivers, the freedom of the existing apps, so Uber and Lyft, for example, the fact that if you drive for Uber, you can also drive for Lyft, and that means you can also drive for a ride-hail cooperative at the same time. So you can gradually build up your clientele rather than have to start out from nothing. And that's what the New York Drivers Co-op, which is a new co-op just started a few weeks ago, will be an interesting test case because those drivers are going to be operating in that kind of an environment. So let me end by saying that to rehabilitate the sharing economy, I don't think regulation or cooperativization on its own is necessarily a high success path. I think we need both of those. But even under best conditions for both of those, it's going to be very hard for the sharing economy to reach its potential and to sort of be a really, the potential of the kinds of things that it might be able to do for its users, workers and consumers, without also changing the conventional economy around it, because those close connections between the sharing sector and the larger economy mean that what happens in the larger economy will always have profound effects on the sharing economy. And therefore, to really rehabilitate, I would say, we need to rehabilitate on a much larger scale. So let me end there, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thanks so much, Juliet, for telling us about what's wrong with the sharing economy, but also telling us about what can be done about it. So I'm very curious to also hear what Elke and Kaja have to say on it. And I would hand over to you, Elke, to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Well, yes, thanks, Juliet, for the great talk. I'm of course familiar with your work, but it has been great to hear you tell the narrative in this way. And I have a number of thoughts, so I'll put them out there in not a specific order. I mean, maybe the first one relates to the overall theme of the series, which is the Polanyian counter-movement topic, right? And I mean, the sharing economy is such a great case in that sense of this idea of trying to embed the market, re-embed it, right, by providing sharing with more social connection. The example you gave of the rights, where you don't just anonymously hop on, but you get into conversation and so on and so forth. And it's really sad that it just didn't work out, right? And it raises the big question of, so to me, it raises that question of what are the forces, right? Clearly, they're market forces. So again, we're nicely within the Polanyian framing. But where do the market forces come from, right? So probably they're different ones, but maybe you have some thought here. I mean, the most obvious one is that, okay, it's if we use the institutional logics perspective, it's just the dominant logic. So this would be very macro, right? We're all living in this market world, and there's just no exit option. So that could be one answer. The second one is maybe looking more micro, right, on the role of the entrepreneurs. What was their motivation? It seemed like their motivation really was to change the world a little bit, but then the question is, did they just not do the calculations properly because they could have anticipated some of these rebound effects, etc.? Was it like they were forced over time to make money by investors and so on? So the market forces came not through the entrepreneurs directly, but through the kind of market institutions around them, like the investors and so on. So that's one aspect here, which also leaves the question: what can we do to re-embed, right? How can we get out of this market logic dominance? And I guess that's exactly the question you pose at the end. And the answer you give is we need to change the conventional economy overall. That's how I link. It links together in my mind. And then the question is, of course, so how can we do that, and who can do that if not regulators? And here I see a parallel, I suppose, to my other research I'm doing, which is on the garment industry or apparel industry, which is of course one struggling with attempts of trying to make it more sustainable for a long time. We have the fair fashion kind of segment, which resonated a bit now with the sharing platforms you described, like the small ones, local ones, the ones that do work out. It's a niche market. It remains a niche market. And from studying that sector, my answer is there has to be regulation. Yeah, I just don't see how the market can be tamed or restrained or restricted without regulations in place. And you were quite pessimistic about that. You mentioned that that's from the US perspective, of course. I'm also really curious of what happens in Europe. There seems to be more awareness and also willingness to regulate the platform economy, but it's also very difficult. And maybe just to give an example of a current research I'm doing, which is we're looking together with a colleague from JKU, Susanne Panichka, we're looking at Uber or these ride-sharing platforms and how they've entered in two local fields, Vienna and Berlin, so cities, urban fields, and the kind of counter movements towards that. And from the interviews that we did, it's interesting because it's such a mixed bag. There's so many different interests on so many levels, and the urban regulators, who have very little say, actually, they clearly see a need of regulating, because it totally undermines everything they've been doing. So they have regulations for carbon emissions. They can't control the traffic anymore. You mentioned public transport. They want to have a certain public transport infrastructure. It's totally undermined by these prices, undercutting of prices of the platforms and so on. But then there's also the national level, where, at least in Germany, there are also these two forces. There's, on the one hand, the market side, right? The ones, also the ministers, the politicians, pushing a liberalization agenda, pushing a digitalization agenda. They want to make everything possible for these platforms. And then typically it's the other ministries, like Ministry for the Environment and so on, who are not really in the core of the market. They're the ones who are concerned. And that's again something we see in the fashion industry. So it's sort of the economics policy. They're all for liberalization, digitalization, and so on. And it's the other ones who see the problems and are trying to regulate, but it's not really their domain. So I suppose that's my impression on that question at the moment. And maybe, so this US versus Europe, I think, is of course a very important aspect. Regulation is very important. When it comes to the COPEs, maybe a final thought on that. There are some interesting initiatives, local ones mostly, and that's maybe another question to think about further, the question of scale, right? Is it more possible to sort of restrain the market on a local scale? It doesn't necessarily seem like that when we look at these right platforms and so on, but the positive examples that are there of the COPs definitely seem to be very locally embedded. I heard about an interesting case, Cope Cycle in Bordeaux in France. They've built a really big network of cyclists. They say they have found a way of competing with the platforms, but they're of course under constant pressure of having to compete with the bigger, more internationally operating platforms. And I think that's we just don't understand it enough to see how this competition really plays out, and if it will remain a niche market, or if there's a way of scaling up these more local, more co-op-oriented initiatives. I have a little project which we're going to study a question like that. There's a food platform in Linz, actually locally, Hungry Llama, that tries to be an alternative to the big delivery-oriented platform. And we want to look at just in very local, very detailed. So what do restaurants do? How do they relate to the big platforms? How do they perceive such a local platform? What's the business case behind it? And I think we need more research like that to understand what's the place for the co-ops, if there's any way they can establish themselves in this bigger, hugely competitive winner-take-all market, like you said. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure Kasia also has some more comments to make. Thanks again.
Many thanks, Elke, for raising a number of points already that we can discuss. And Kasia, I would also hand over to you, and I'm curious about your thoughts.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. Good. So yeah, first of all, thanks, Juliet. I am really actually quite honored to be here, because the work of your team has been an integral part of my PhD, which I started more or less in 2014-13. So I've always appreciated also this very organized way of trying to look at the variety, right? So like coming back to this terminology and what kind of could have been thrown into this sharing economy bag, what was at that point and what not. So I am very happy to also be able to comment now on the more current work. And yeah, I have a couple of questions which are more broad and a couple of points also to pick up from what Elke was mentioning already. So maybe I start with also asking about more positive things first, let's say, for a change. So in this latest book, you've also mentioned, for example, flexibility and the role of flexibility, for example, for disabled workers, or basically people who also find work on platforms who would have had a substantial issue to find work elsewhere. I would be just interested in getting to know a bit more what you found on your data about that or other cases. So where are those platforms actually benefiting workers also on top of exploiting them in some other ways? So that brings me also to my next point. Let me just take a look about this distinction between dependent and supplemental workers. So you said that the majority in the platforms of that you have investigated in this very impressive sample over the years are supplemental workers. But could you give us like a number for that? What is the majority? How does it change in the sectors? A little bit more detailed look on that. And also, do you have already some of such information, such data on the care sector? So I was very happy to see care.com on your current list of suspects, let's call it like that. Also because of my own research. So I am specifically focusing on a platform called Helpling right now, where you can find a cleaner for your home. So that brings me to my next point and a bit of a kind of a challenging point maybe. So I'm not sure how far I would agree with this impression that you draw from the literature on the homogeneity of experiences of platform workers. Perhaps this is also a question of location. I don't know what you think, because I also am I'm looking at Germany. I'm definitely much more consuming this geographical location literature. So maybe that's also an open question to Elke. What do you think about that? My impression is that actually there is a lot of commonality seen in the way of algorithmic management and control tools implemented by platforms, but the experiences I would actually say that are definitely reflecting quite some variety, but this common thread for me is also this grounding in what's going on outside of the platforms offline. So that's a really important point also, I think, to stress again. So this kind of it slowly becomes a bit of a chicken egg question, right? So the dependent workers, as you said, they come from specific socioeconomic backgrounds. So our platforms then just basically a possibly full of potential technology that ended up in the wrong capitalistic hands, let's call it like that, and that also have become this vehicle for venture capital, which has exploitation of workers built into its veins anyhow. So this is like a very dramatic story. I mean, if you move in this platform capitalism literature, I think it's also understandable that doing this research can have a bit of a not so much hopeful undertone. But coming back to this hope and the future, and for example, the regulation question, and maybe then I stop because I also don't want to, maybe we have more space for the discussion later and I leave it here. So I was wondering, I don't know if you have also looked into the recent ILO publication on platform work. So the report actually from February this year, I believe. So I was just looking at it also, what do they have to say about regulation? And they mentioned, for example, that there is apparently a World Economic Forum Charter of Principles of for good platform work. For example, such instruments which have, I just took a look quickly, they, of course, like, it's an involuntary document that platforms, for example, such as Uber, have already signed, so pledged to reach, for example, safety and well-being of workers and of users of the platform, flexibility, but also fair conditions. So it's a lot of like very high-fly words. And I wonder what you also both think about the pointless, or let's say the helplessness, the helpfulness of such tools in also steering us a bit away from this capitalist take-it-all exploitation story. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kasia, for these thoughts and questions. So, Juliet, I feel we have many questions and comments on the table now, some more specific ones, also some more broader ones. I would just hand over to you to select what you want to discuss about.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Thank you both. Those are such excellent comments and questions, and there's so much to talk about from what you have both raised. Let me start with Elke's point about the Polanyian counter movement and the sort of forces that led to kind of more conventionalization or marketization. And, you know, I'm not exactly sure. I would say, you know, I probably would have gone to the first place you went to, which is the kind of dominant logic of the market. I think that played a big role. There are people who say it's all about the financing and the investor pressures. I think we need some more evidence to figure out how true that is. I mean, to a large extent, these companies have been allowed to just expand their markets without a lot of pressure for profitability. The ride-hail are obviously coming under more profitability pressure now, but I think for a large part of this time, the profitability pressures were not so great. It was really more about expansion of the market. We have a wonderful, one of our respondents who worked in food delivery, you know, bicycle couriering, and she'd been a startup entrepreneur herself. She was, I think, in Germany doing startups, and she was just talking about how insane the whole system was, where these investors were just throwing huge amounts of money at these startups that had no idea what they were doing and no path to profitability and so forth. And, you know, in the end, her startup didn't work, and now she's, you know, cycling for money. So I'm a little bit, I would need to see more evidence about that it's the finance capital. But your point about the entrepreneurs and what they believed, I think this is where I feel that I don't think it's intentionally cynical from the beginning. So Uber is different. Uber never had the idealist discourse. Uber is like a very right-wing company which believes in the market and the free market, and, you know, but almost all of the others had this other thing. And you look at their origin stories and they're very feel-goody and so on and so forth. But I talked to quite a few entrepreneurs while I was doing this research, because they were seeking me out, because I was one of the first researchers. And one of the things that I came away feeling was that their commitment to things other than profit was very, very tenuous, it just felt fraudulent to me, because when I would point things out to them, they didn't want to hear it. I'm not sure they really wanted to change the world. They may have convinced themselves they did in the early days. But your points about regulation, I think, are right on. And I guess that takes me to like the really big point, which is that in order to regulate effectively, the regulators can't do it on their own. There have to be those pressures from civil society, whether it's unions, consumer groups, political parties, sort of really pushing to limit the scope of the market forces. I know that's a kind of simplistic way of thinking about it, but these are sort of hyper marketized entities. I mean, if you think about the real-time equilibration of supply and demand through surge pricing, and they're kind of taking those market principles to the extreme. And to me, but there are different ways to go about this. And I think one of the most powerful ways would be not actually necessarily through regulating this sector, but by doing certain things outside of this sector, which would dramatically alter the conditions on which they could get workers. So for example, a robust universal basic income and basic services would do a lot to put workers in the position where none of them would have to be dependent workers, for example. And if they're working on these platforms, it's because they want to, and the conditions are, reasonable to them. They're not forced. So, there are a number of different kinds of regulations that we could think about that could have big impacts on the sector. And I'm very interested in the co-op cycle network and the food platform that you're talking about and so forth. So lots to talk about there. So Kasia, the disabled workers are really interesting, and we didn't come upon enough of them in our initial work. In the first project, for me to recognize it, I'm forgetting her name now, but a sociologist who did her PhD at the University of Texas, who wrote a paper on this. And what's really interesting is, and this goes back to something that Elke and I have talked about quite a bit, but the flexibility and autonomy that workers have on these platforms is really valuable. It's valuable for many of the workers who are on them. But especially for disabled workers, because many disabled workers have illnesses that make it unpredictable when they can work and when they can't. And so whether it's driving or grocery shopping or whatever, and we're finding in my second project, we're finding more of these workers, many of them women in the shopping, the grocery shopping and so forth, who for whom these kinds of arrangements are really good. Now, ride hail and food delivery have the most flexibility in the sense that you can turn the app on minute by minute. A lot of these other apps, you have to sign up for shifts. But even so, those are, you don't necessarily have to sign up that far in advance and so forth, and you can cancel your shift. So I think you're finding them across different apps, and it depends on whether people have mental disabilities, physical disabilities, etc. I can give you more details. So we had actually 3 categories. We had dependent, and I need to just pull up, I can pull up I won't share my screen again, but in our first study, we had 25% dependent, we had 32% partially dependent. Those are people who rely on this income to pay some of their expenses, and then 43% supplementals. And that's a kind of meaningless breakdown because we had different sample sizes across the cases. So the cases matter a lot. On Airbnb, you have far fewer dependents. There are some, but not many. On Uber and Lyft, we have a very small driver sample in our original project. We only had 17, I think. 75% of them were dependents. But that's much higher than the national numbers on them. So that depends. And I think I made this point. I think the number of dependents is rising over time, at least on some of those apps. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. For the care work, we started with childcare, where again, you have that mix, the full-time nannies versus the, occasional childcare workers. We were trying to interview cleaners. We've had a hard time getting them. So I think you may do that. And are the dependent workers from specific socioeconomic backgrounds? It's a it's a good question. I think that you see that more on the lower wage platforms now, where you're more likely to have immigrant and workers of color. I was at a meeting about the gig company workers have come to my state to try and overturn our labor laws. And I was having a meeting about it with a lot of people from the labor unions and the immigrant groups and NAA, the civil rights groups and so forth. And one of the statistics that someone said was 70% of Lyft drivers are Black, brown, or immigrant. So, but the little bit of a rub there is it's also a very tends to be a highly educated workforce. So even some of our most dependent workers on some of the platforms were people who had high-flying software jobs that they lost in the recession. I mean, that's another issue, which is sort of proximity to the crash of 2008. And, we started interviewing not that many years after that. So there was also that overhang. So I would say on average, they are socioeconomically less advantaged than the supplementals for sure. But these are not necessarily the kind of most disadvantaged workers that you can find, maybe in some of the worst cases. And then I'll end with the question about the ILO report and these charters. And there are other efforts too, the Oxford Internet Institute, they've been doing the Fair Work Charter and so forth. I would say that from some of these companies, it's totally fraudulent. I mean, the fact that Uber signed something like that, when what they've done in California with their Proposition 22 and what they're trying to do around the rest of the country is actually a huge step backwards, both from the point of view of the rights that workers legally have in those cases, which is they're taking them away. They've never wanted to acknowledge them, but these are the laws. In Massachusetts, we've had a law that makes gig workers employees since the 1990s, basically. But what's happened after Prop 22, where they said, okay, yeah, we're going to be a better employer. We recognize things aren't going so well. We're going to give you more money. We're going to give you benefits. It's been terrible. There is no minimum wage. And people have to, they get nothing while they're waiting for jobs. So their minimum, one of my colleagues calculated, it's likely going to be something based on past data, something like $6 an hour, where the minimum wage should be at least 15. And almost none of the drivers are eligible for the benefits. And then some of the other laws they just tried to do something in New York where they're taking away the rights to join a union of their choice and so forth. So it's totally disingenuous on Uber's part. I mean, I've heard this especially in Europe, where they talked a better line earlier. They'd say things like, oh, we want a universal basic income so much, and we want the government to do this, and they've been saying that for years and years, and it's just not true, because those things would really undermine their model. So, on the other hand, there may be a few platforms that have signed such a charter that have good intentions, but for the most part, they're pretty rapacious when they can be, I would say.
Great, thanks, Juliet. At this point, I also want to bring in two questions from the audience, and we have some minutes left. And the first is by Saha, and she or he is asking, another problem with Airbnb is what I heard about is that in popular cities such as Barcelona, Airbnb pushes out residents and it is financially more interesting to rent to tourists instead of getting a normal rent price. This is a problem when this becomes a business instead of normal people actually sharing. Who wants to respond?
Well, I'll just say one thing. We've done a lot of work on this topic. So yes, and I haven't talked much about Airbnb because I focused a little more on the labor stuff, but Airbnb has many so-called externalities. On Airbnb, the people who use it are generally pretty happy, the hosts and the guests. It's the people who live in the cities where there's a lot of Airbnb activity who have bad impacts. And so the rent, it's called the rent gap, the difference between what you can earn renting a space on the short-term rental market to the long-term. It generally tends to close over time. So it was like 3 to 4 times, you know, in the early days of Airbnb coming in, it tends to be 3 to 4 times. It closes over time in part because the rental prices go up, housing prices go up and rent prices go up. And so this has been one of the big problems for cities and why they are regulating. Also, the rental availability changes. And it's why Barcelona has had one of the strictest, if not the strictest, Airbnb regulations in the world. So yes, and when you say it becomes a problem when it's a business, that was that point I was making. We're finding that even with the regulations, the shift toward much more business use of properties, meaning many more days rented per year, where you can see it just becomes a purely commercial property increase. The one thing I'd say is there's a little wrinkle on this since the pandemic, which is you have had a shift to longer term stays on Airbnb. People are traveling a little bit differently. So some of that gap will fall because when people stay longer in a property, they pay a lower per night fee. But this is exactly right. And this has been a big problem with Airbnb. And then the other thing is kind of neighborhood quality, where people live in neighborhoods that just get turned into tourist areas, and that ruins their quality of their neighborhoods.
And I guess it's also, there's the interesting question of what happens with the Airbnb units now during the pandemic and in the coming years, depending, I guess, also on what happens to tourism in the coming years. We have another question by anonymous viewer or anonymer Zuschauer, and it says, to what extent do you think is the Silicon Valley still an influential ideological source for the platform economy, as you referred to the cyber utopianism 20 or 30 years ago? What would be the ideology that shapes the platform economy today? What vision of good society, promise of technology, and the partnership of market or state?
Well, I think the questioner is right that the sort of early cyber utopian kind of discourse has waned. I would say today the big platforms are emphasizing more 2 things. One is economic opportunity and sort of the new way to work and the flexibility. And then with Airbnb, it's more about the ability of middle-class people to, keep their incomes up through renting. And so the platforms use an ideology of helping the little guy, the little person, the individual against, the moneyed interests or, the bad economic forces that they're facing. Plus that there still is that technological utopianism that, we have all this great technology. And, that's kind of a fraud at this point, because the technology is now fairly standard, kind of basic. There's nothing all that cutting edge about the technologies that these companies are using. But I think it really is more economic opportunity that is, and that gets back to Elke's point about the fights among the ministers, where it's the kind of more economically and commercially oriented ministries that want to push this versus environment, labor, social ministries. And it's happening in the context of, economic crisis in terms of jobs and income. So they're putting themselves out as the solution to those crises.
We have a few moments left, so I want to give Elke and Kasia the chance for also some final reflections from your side, perhaps in response to some of the points that Juliet mentioned.
Yes, sure. I mean, I wanted to respond to Kasha's point also about the ILO and the World Economic Forum and these kind of more normative frameworks, because of course, in the apparel industry, which I mentioned before, they also play an important role. And what we've seen there now when it comes to labor is that these, the UNGPs, the guiding principles for human rights, they've been put out in 2011. They definitely haven't had a direct impact, but they've sort of had a long trickling on effect with intermingled with other stuff happening and regulatory initiatives on different levels. So it's not a unicausal thing, but it's important to have these normative frameworks around for people that try to regulate the space to draw on. And now they've become very important with the due diligence legislations being developed in different countries and hopefully on an EU level. So I think they are important, but not on their own, and the effect will probably be longer term. And it plays again into this point of regulation is important, but what do we need to regulate, right? And that's also what Juliet mentioned. What's the domain actually that we need to regulate, right? When it comes to Airbnb, maybe it's not Airbnb, but what the problem is that housing in cities in generally is becoming more expensive and more scarce. So it's a different domain of regulation, but one that directly affects the ways platforms can operate. And similarly, when it comes to labor, what Juliet mentioned about the basic income. So we really need to think about broader domains of what actually needs to be regulated and by whom. And I think that's the picture Juliet drew anyway, in terms of we need to think about the conventional economy and even conventional society with all the different domains of society in which these platforms kind of go into. I think that's what I'm taking away from the session today.
Thanks, Elke. Kasha, do you want to jump in with some final reflections?
Yes. So to continue with this regulation topic, I think it's also, it's a difficult question, but I mean, this is not the first topic with which there is an issue with like capturing it via regulatory institutions. So I have still a slight hope for humanity that there will be some historical learning processes, but this is maybe because it's a sunny day today here. So I'm a bit more positive. Let's talk on a rainy day can change. But I also wanted to maybe close with a point that one area apart from labor laws, and here, of course, this heterogeneity of the experiences about which Juliet's work is so in detail talking about, actually, is also the part of this regulatory struggle, right? Because like, at least I know from my own observations also of attending conferences, for example, where you have people who talk about EU regulation in terms of platform labor, where exactly even defining who a platform, what makes a platform worker and what doesn't is really taking a lot of time. So the speed difference is a bit concerning here, I would say, in reaction. And maybe to finish on a more Polanyi pun, I think that Polanyi in general would be fascinated by the concept of data in a digitally mediated work, and be it labor work in that sense of on-demand services, or also other type of data that is being collected by other type of platform infrastructures, right? So I will finish on that maybe. Thank you for the discussions.
Many thanks, Kasha. This is a great way to close this. We have gone a bit more than 90 minutes, and I think I've heard fascinating reflections, ideas, and research findings on the sharing economy. I don't see any more questions from the audience, so my suggestion would be that we close here. And I really want to thank all three speakers for being with us. and to the Polanyi Society for organizing this. It was a pleasure to be here and to spend this evening with you and with all the anonymous people that attended this session that we didn't see. But I hope you enjoyed. That's basically it. And I'm not sure if Stefan, you want to say some final words on behalf of VHS. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. Also, Justin, thank you for facilitating this event, and thanks to everyone who attended it and to the speakers. It was really great. The series, the lecture series, the counter movement lecture series will be continued in the next semester from October on. So every the information will be available soon at www.vhs.at/Gegenbewegungen, I say it in German, and yeah, you will find every information there. And I just want to say have a nice summer, and thank you, and a nice evening.